Red Lodge, Montana, which is a very close-knit community. Everybody knows everybody. This homicide, everybody was talking about it. And everybody had their own theories on why it happened and what had happened.
I remember the first time when I went to court, they all looked at me differently, like I was a monster. I kept trying to tell them I never meant for anything to happen. I'm not a cold-blooded killer. There was no, in any way, shape, or form, any intention of hurting my best friend, ever, ever, ever. Are we good to go?
We are good to go.
Okay. My name's Thomas Schiffern. I'm 37 years old. I'm currently imprisoned in Shelby, Montana for the death of my best friend. I was born in 1984 in Kern County, California. When I was 4 years old, my parents divorced. My dad got remarried to my stepmother. Life got really hard for me. My stepmother really didn't like me at all. I was locked in a room a lot. I wasn't allowed out. I wasn't allowed to play. I wasn't allowed to pretty much do anything except for go to school and back. That continued pretty much through my childhood. That's when things got really bad. I got caught smoking upstairs in my brother's bedroom one day. My stepmom got mad about it, so that very night they pretty much kicked me out the back door and told me never to come back. Red Lodge is a ski resort town. There's a lot of rich people. The cops, once you're on their radar, they are on you all the time for the rest of your life. Because I'm a convicted felon and because of who I was, nobody would ever hire me. She was awesome. She understood that what I had been through and she didn't judge me for it. So it felt good for once in my life to not be judged for, my past. I repaired chainsaws, I cut a lot of wood for them, I did a lot of welding for them. And that's where I met Jim. He was like a small, frail man with a white beard. He was always smoking his pipe, he always had his pipe on him, sitting there next to the fire stove. I guess I would just sit there and listen to his stories, his ranching days. It gets below zero quite a bit in Red Lodge. Jim's shack didn't have any heat, didn't have any water in it. He didn't have a place to go to when it was cold, and so me and Shiloh decided to invite him into our home. Inseparable. I mean, everywhere I was, Jim was. Everywhere Jim was, I was. We went out shooting a lot. We went fishing a lot. We went and did everything. He loved the outdoors. Things were good till that awful day. It was a regular day. We stopped at the store and we bought some beer. We'd drive out of town. And we kept driving out of town. I believe the place was called Bear Track. We pulled in. I got out. I was kind of like, the creek's frozen here. I don't really want to fish here. So Jim gets out and he had his 357 on him. And, we just did what we love to do. We started shooting, we started shooting at trees. And he tried to twirl it on his fingers. I told him that he looked like Billy the Kid. You look like Billy the Kid with that thing. He wasn't really twirling it. He was just trying to, he was trying to make the motions to do it. And it was hilarious. By that time, we had been drinking all day, so we were just having a good time, more or less. I told him, let me see the gun. I want to try it. I want to try it and see if I could do what he was doing. So he handed me the gun, and I remember there was 2 shots left in it. And I was gonna try to, twirl it and act like, some kind of cowboy, some Billy the Kid, see if I could do it. And I remember twirling it forward, and the gun went off. And I remember seeing Jim fall to the ground. And at that point, I guess I didn't comprehend at the moment what had just happened, because I didn't expect the gun to go off like that. I remember walking over to Jim, and I grabbed his leg to, I said, "Jim, get up, stop playing around, stop effing around." And I felt how limp his leg was, and I knew that there was something wrong. And that's when I saw the blood in the snow. It felt like my soul had been ripped out of my body at that time, because I knew Jim wasn't there anymore. I can't tell you how many times I told him it was an accident that day. They tried to say that I had Jim on his knees, and then I had a gun to the back of his head, and then I shot him. I'm not gonna lie about what happened. I'm not a cold-blooded killer. Didn't mean for anything to happen. I kept trying to tell him I never meant to hurt Jim. It was an accident. I think about Jim quite a bit. He was the only friend I really had.
When Jimmy was found deceased, I was torn apart. My heart was broken. And to find out that such a gentle soul was taken in such a violent manner, it made it hurt that much worse. I am John Price, and one of my best friends was Jimmy McGregor. Whenever I work on a skull like this, I think of Jimmy, knowing that he would look down right now and just see how I'm preserving someone's hunting memories for a lifetime. Being that this occurred in such a small town, a lot of rumors went flying around. People still speculate about it. People still try to figure out a motive. This sort of thing just does not happen in Red Lodge. Jimmy was a kind and gentle man, always had a smile, always greeted you with a handshake, wanted to know how the family was doing and whether you were doing well. Jimmy's relationship with money was he had very little. He pretty much was penniless. Jimmy and I were talking one afternoon, and he had had some assistance from a local woman that helped him file for his Social Security. He realized that he was going to get one lump sum at the beginning and then his monthly payment. We were just so happy for him to finally get to that stage where he would have a steady income to sustain himself throughout the year. Red Lodge is a very small town, so it doesn't take long for word to travel around that Jimmy was going to be coming into his Social Security finally. TJ was very forward with Jimmy as far as his affections and such. It was like he had prior motive for building that relationship. I found out that Jimmy had moved in with TJ and his wife Shiloh and was very concerned. All of us were.
Me and Jim became inseparable. I mean, everywhere I was, Jim was. Everywhere Jim was, I was. I think about Jim quite a bit because he was the only friend I really had. You know, there wasn't a lot that I wouldn't do for that guy.
It's all a lie. He made out that he and Jimmy were best of friends, and that was far from the case. TJ and Jimmy's relationship was a relationship of convenience. TJ played that part to a T by taking advantage of Jim. I had discovered that Jimmy had purchased a truck. This was alarming because Jimmy did not drive, so he had no use for the truck. I feel that he was taken advantage of, that TJ needed a vehicle and preyed on him. I think TJ did it strictly for the money. He knew Jimmy had money, and killing him was going to be the quickest way for him to get all of it at once.
My name is Josh McQuillan. I am the Carbon County Sheriff in Red Lodge, Montana. So we're heading south out of Red Lodge right now. This is the area in which we had received a call at dispatch that Jimmy's truck had been found. It was very unusual that we found Jimmy's truck all the way down here. This is an area that is frequented during the summer by campers, but not so much during the winter time. At that time, snow down here was well over a foot to 18 inches deep. And simply put, people just don't come down here when there's that kind of snow. As we proceeded down here, we could see the truck, and then we actually found some blood on the ground and then drag marks that led us over here to this embankment that drops down into Rock Creek. We were able to see Jimmy's body covered in snow, laying on his back, and he had obviously been drugged about halfway down this embankment. We could clearly see that there was one gunshot wound to the head. This spot can't be seen from the highway. So there's a good chance that if we hadn't received that tip and came down here when we did, it's unlikely that we would have found him until the spring thaw, when this became a more popular area with people. It was apparent that whoever had done this to Jimmy had tried to hide his body and had no regard for trying to help him.
What did I do? What did I do?
You can play the game.
I'm not. What did I do?
You killed somebody.
No, I fucking how? I don't even have the balls to kill somebody. Are you serious?
Oh, I'm dead serious.
It was an accident. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. As soon as I cocked back the hammer, the gun went off. And I saw Jimmy fall. And it scared me.
You know, I really don't know what happened that day. Only TJ and Jimmy know what happened that day. And I don't want to speculate on that. I do know that they spent a lot of time together, playing with guns and drinking, and that doesn't mix. My name is Susan Russell, and I am TJ's mother-in-law. Why would TJ kill Jimmy? He loved Jimmy. He always would say, I love Jimmy. Jimmy was his friend, his best friend. I went over and seen them maybe a week before this all happened. Everybody was happy and laughing and getting along just fine. People in the right frame of mind would probably have called 911 if they shot somebody accidentally. But TJ was scared to death. Nobody in Red Lodge liked TJ. So I think even if it was an accident, nobody would believe him. I think he would run scared because he wasn't in his right frame of mind. I can understand him doing that. I'm not justifying it, but I can see that he would do that, yes. TJ had a lot of issues growing up. You know, I don't want to get into a lot of his personal life, but there was abuse in different areas. He had it rough. He's sentimental. He cries over movies. He's gentle. He's kind. If this had went to trial, I don't think TJ would have had a prayer because this is a small community and he was the bad guy. Nobody cared about TJ. Jimmy was well loved in this community, and TJ, they figured he was just a monster. People know I'm TJ's mother-in-law, and I keep in touch with TJ. And people say, you talk to him. Why would you talk to him? It's like, why wouldn't I talk to him? Who does he have to turn to? I'm all he's got right now.
My name is Dave Bisher. I'm the owner of AY Supply in Red Lodge, Montana. I've had many men come and help me, kind of down and out men. People show up and they're hungry and they need a day's work. TJ, he was needing work and couldn't find any. It worked out fairly well at first. Since TJ was working for me, I let TJ and his wife, Shiloh, live in a house that I owned about 6 miles that way. I kind of overlooked the fact that occasionally they couldn't pay the rent. Jim was a neighbor that lived a couple of blocks away. He was a very nice guy. We had a number of guys hanging out. TJ and Jim met each other here and became somewhat of friends. But another fellow here at the shop, he said to me, it was like mixing gasoline and matches. I guess he thought less of TJ than I did.
me and Shiloh, we were common law married, I guess, because we'd lived together for so long. For a long time, I'd watch these jewelry commercials or whatever, and I always wanted to get her a real wedding ring. So I had asked the guy I worked for, Dave, at AY Supply, for some of the money to buy a ring for her, and he ended up loaning me the money. I don't know exactly how much, a couple thousand, I guess. This was a few days before all this happened.
Huh. That's crazy. I never loaned him $2,000. Not that I know of. And certainly not a few days before this crime. There was no point at which TJ came to me and with a sob story and said, I need to get Shiloh a nice piece of jewelry, a ring. He never said that to me. That just didn't happen. He didn't borrow $2,000 from me. And my gosh, I wouldn't trust TJ with it. I knew him well enough that I didn't need to be giving him any money, ring or no ring, for his wife.
I remember twirling it forward, and my thumb had caught the hammer on it. And when the gun started coming back, my first instinct was to push my finger down, and the gun went off. And it was so loud, it scared me. I remember seeing Jim fall to the ground. And at that point, I guess I didn't comprehend at the moment what had just happened, because I didn't expect the gun to go off like that. Am I guilty for killing somebody? Yes, absolutely. I did. Am I guilty of deliberate homicide for intentionally killing somebody, premeditated killing my best friend? Absolutely not.
What TJ just said is basically nonsense. I don't know why TJ won't admit to what actually happened that day. So this is the murder weapon. So what you can see, that is the .357 King Cobra revolver. This is a pretty heavy gun, and TJ talks about while he's twirling it on his finger, he accidentally pulls this back. And you can see this requires pressure to pull this back, a true effort to do that, while at the same time pulling the trigger. Just even doing this right now, it's not something you accidentally do. That's a deliberate act. And Jimmy just happens to be right in front of him. And if you look at the autopsy photo, it can show the trajectory of the bullet, and it's a straight shot. The bullet goes basically level with him, enters and exits his head in that line. So I don't believe TJ, and I don't think it's even remotely possible that that's what happened.
This was a strong case from the very beginning. And certainly we were ready to go to trial when we learned that he was ready to change his plea. What would somebody do if they really did accidentally shoot their friend through the head? Are you going to try to call law enforcement or medical aid? Or do you take his money? Do you drag his body down to the creek where it's going to be harder to find? There's nothing that he does that is consistent with any sort of concern for the well-being of his friend. My name is Alex Nixon, and I'm the Carbon County Attorney in Red Lodge, Montana. It's pretty hard to believe that this was anything but a homicide. And we were very confident that we could get a conviction. We had an actual firsthand admission of what happened that evening. TJ tells Kristen that he had killed the man because he was homeless and disrespectful. She said that he begged for his life. She said that TJ described dragging the body where it would be harder to find. It was a big deal because here you have a description of not a person who was sorry or sympathetic because he had just killed his so-called best friend, but you have somebody who's angry, who felt like he was a victim, that he was being disrespected, he wasn't being properly appreciated. What you heard about was somebody describing a brutal, cold-blooded homicide. It was anything but the story of an accidental killing.
They made me really sound like a monster. They tried to say that I had Jim on his knees and that I had a gun to the back of his head and that I shot him, which is not even close to the truth.
Listening to this, it seems that TJ was trying to say that the narrative of Jimmy being on his knees was one that was created by investigators, when in fact we have him to blame for that story. That is the story he told Kristen. What the final motivator was for TJ to kill Jimmy, I don't know. What was most important was there was no doubt that TJ killed Jimmy. It was just a matter of which story you wanted to believe. At the end of the day, TJ wants you to believe he's not a murderer, he's just a really shitty friend.
I don't know how to defend myself anymore. I don't know what to say to convince people. If I would have kept my mouth shut, just denied the whole thing and lied about it, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. Yeah, I didn't go to the cops at the beginning. I was terrified. I just took somebody's life. You know, put yourself in my shoes during that 30 seconds. 2 seconds. You know, that fraction of a second changed the course of many people's lives. I do understand why there's a lot of people that don't trust me because, you know, or don't believe anything that I say. I do understand that. And there's no way that I can fix that. There's no way that I can fix that. You know?
So this is the murder weapon. And TJ talks about while he's twirling it on his finger, he accidentally pulls this back. This requires pressure while at the same time pulling the trigger. It's not something you accidentally do. That's a deliberate act.
Well, whatever, I guess. Whatever. He's saying that it's, you know, it takes a lot of pressure. It don't take a lot of pressure. I've shot that gun many hundreds of times. That very same gun I've shot. Me and Jimmy went shooting all the time.
It's quite compelling seeing the sheriff show how hard it is to pull that trigger back.
Oh yeah, I imagine. And I imagine he put on a good act and tried and made it look like it was quite a bit harder than actually it is, because it's not really that hard. He's trying to make it sound like there's only one way that this is, and this is the way it could have happened. You know, that's a lie. It's a lie. I don't care what people say. You know, I was there. I know what happened. You know, I never intentionally intended to hurt anybody. Never have and never will. Just not that person.
So everybody that's saying otherwise is wrong.
They're dead wrong. They're liars. And I'd love to tell them to their face, you're lying. You're a liar. What do I have to lose? I got a life sentence. I killed a man. That man was my best friend. And I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. There's no words to say how sorry I am for what happened.
The first clue did not come from blood. It did not come from a witness hiding a guilty secret or from a detective making a brilliant deduction. It came from absence. A child vanished in broad daylight, leaving behind nothing louder than silence, and that silence would echo across Canada for more than 3 decades before science finally uncovered a truth that no one had imagined could remain hidden for so long. Long before DNA databases transformed criminal investigations, before genetic genealogy changed the future of cold cases around the world, a quiet farming community in Ontario became the setting for one of Canada's most haunting child murder investigations. On an October afternoon in 1984, families were preparing for another ordinary autumn evening. Harvest season had painted the countryside in shades of fading gold. The roads around Queensville were familiar, quiet, lined with fields that stretched toward the horizon. Parents knew their neighbors. Children walked the same routes every day. Nothing suggested that history was about to remember this place for a tragedy that would become one of the country's most controversial criminal cases. 9-year-old Christine Jessup was like countless children growing up in rural Ontario. She was energetic, curious, and trusted the world around her. Her family believed she could safely walk the short distance through the neighborhood, just as children in that era often did. There were no mobile phones. No surveillance cameras watched every intersection. No GPS signals recorded every movement. Childhood still carried a sense of freedom that many families considered perfectly normal. It was Saturday, October 3rd, Sill, 1984. Christine left home intending to visit a nearby friend. The trip was supposed to take only minutes. Instead, it became the final journey anyone would ever see her make. Hours began to pass. At first, there was little reason for alarm. Children often stayed longer than expected while playing. But as daylight slowly faded into evening and Christine failed to return, ordinary concern transformed into panic. Phone calls began. Relatives searched nearby roads. Friends knocked on doors. Every minute without an answer deepened the fear that something had gone terribly wrong. Soon the local police were called. Officers initially approached the disappearance as they often did during the early hours of a missing child report. Perhaps she had wandered farther than expected. Perhaps she was staying with another family. Perhaps there had simply been a misunderstanding. But as investigators retraced Christine's expected route, none of those possibilities survived very long. No one could confidently explain where she had gone after leaving home. No witness could provide a complete timeline. No obvious accident had occurred. It was as if the child had simply disappeared into the Ontario countryside. The response escalated rapidly. Volunteers flooded into the area. Farmers paused their work. Search teams combed fields, wooded areas, drainage ditches, and abandoned properties. Helicopters scanned the landscape from above, while officers coordinated one of the largest missing child searches the region had ever witnessed. Every abandoned building became a point of interest. Every vehicle spotted along rural roads drew attention. Every stranger passing through Queensville suddenly mattered. Hope remained alive during those first desperate days because missing children are often found. Families clung to the belief that Christine might still be waiting somewhere, frightened but alive. Searchers called her name across empty fields. Divers examined nearby bodies of water. Mounted officers covered difficult terrain inaccessible to vehicles. Entire communities united with a single purpose: bring Christine home. But the longer the search continued, the darker the possibilities became. Investigators began examining whether someone had deliberately taken her. Reports of unfamiliar vehicles surfaced. Some witnesses attempted to remember details that suddenly seemed important days after the fact. Memories became uncertain. Colors changed. Timelines shifted. Faces glimpsed briefly through car windows became impossible to identify with confidence. Detectives knew that witness recollections often become distorted under the pressure of tragedy, yet every lead demanded attention because there was almost nothing else to follow. Newspapers across Ontario began reporting the disappearance. Television broadcasts reached audiences far beyond the immediate community. Parents across Canada looked at photographs of Christine's smiling face and imagined their own children. Fear spread quickly. Rural communities that had once believed themselves insulated from violent crime suddenly questioned long-held assumptions about safety. Parents changed routines overnight. Children were warned never to walk alone. Doors that had once remained unlocked were now secured before nightfall. The disappearance was no longer just one family's nightmare. It had become a national concern. Days stretched into weeks. The search continued with diminishing optimism. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people: family members, neighbors, delivery drivers, construction workers, travelers, anyone whose movements intersected with Queensville during those critical hours became part of an expanding investigation. Tips arrived from across the country. Some were sincere attempts to help. Others were misunderstandings or false sightings. Each required valuable investigative resources. Every new possibility briefly reignited hope before collapsing under scrutiny. Then, on December 31st, SIL 1984, nearly 3 months after Christine disappeared, the case entered its darkest chapter. Her body was discovered in a wooded area near Sunderland, Ontario, many kilometers from where she had last been seen. The location suggested that whoever had taken her had transported her away from Queensville before leaving her remains in an isolated rural setting. The discovery devastated everyone who had continued hoping for a miracle. Search posters instantly became memorials. The missing child investigation became a homicide investigation. Grief settled over the Jessup family with unimaginable weight. Detectives immediately secured the scene. Forensic specialists documented every possible piece of evidence using the technology available in 1984. Clothing, biological samples, soil, vegetation, fibers, and countless microscopic traces were carefully collected. Even then, experienced investigators understood that seemingly insignificant evidence might one day prove decisive, even if contemporary science could not yet unlock its secrets. That foresight would become one of the most important decisions ever made in the history of the investigation. The autopsy confirmed that Christine had been murdered. The brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators accustomed to violent cases. Public outrage intensified. Pressure mounted on police to identify whoever had committed such an unimaginable act against a child. Every day without an arrest deepened community anxiety. Rumors flourished. Speculation spread through neighborhoods, workplaces, schools, and newspaper columns. In the absence of answers, people created their own. Detectives now faced two battles simultaneously. One involved finding the killer. The other involved separating facts from fear. The investigation expanded across multiple jurisdictions as officers attempted to reconstruct Christine's final known movements. They mapped roads connecting Queensville to Sunderland. They examined vehicle traffic patterns. They revisited every interview conducted during the missing person phase. They searched for anyone with a history of violent offenses against children. Yet, despite extraordinary effort, the investigation produced no clear suspects supported by conclusive physical evidence. The forensic limitations of the mid-1980s created enormous challenges. DNA profiling existed only in its infancy and was not yet available as an investigative tool in Canadian criminal cases. Biological evidence that today could be analyzed within days instead remained preserved inside evidence lockers, waiting for scientific methods that had not yet been invented. Detectives relied heavily on interviews, witness statements, behavioral assessments, timelines, and circumstantial evidence. Those methods solved many crimes. But in cases involving strangers, isolated locations, and minimal eyewitness testimony, they often reached frustrating dead ends. Public attention continued to intensify. National media followed every development. Each reported sighting generated temporary excitement. Every police press conference raised expectations that an arrest might finally be imminent. Families watched evening news broadcasts hoping investigators had discovered the breakthrough everyone desperately wanted. Instead, updates increasingly focused on appeals for additional information rather than concrete progress. Inside the investigative headquarters, walls filled with maps, photographs, interview summaries, and timelines. Detectives spent endless hours reviewing notes already examined dozens of times before. Fresh eyes searched for overlooked inconsistencies. Small details once dismissed as irrelevant were reconsidered. Experienced investigators often understood that cold cases are sometimes solved not because new evidence appears, but because existing evidence is interpreted differently. Yet no matter how many times the files were reviewed, certainty remained elusive. The community itself became part of the investigation. Officers encouraged residents to report anything unusual they had noticed during the autumn of 1984, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Strange vehicles, unexpected visitors, suspicious conversations, changes in behavior, anonymous telephone calls. Every possibility entered the growing archive. Thousands of pages accumulated. Thousands of hours of interviews were conducted. But information alone does not solve a homicide unless it points toward truth. And truth remained hidden somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. For Christine's family, every sunrise marked another day without justice. Their grief unfolded under constant public attention. Unlike private tragedies that slowly retreat from headlines, this case remained a national story. Reporters revisited anniversaries. Television documentaries examined the investigation. Appeals for information continued year after year. Hope became something different. It was no longer hope that Christine would return. It became hope that someday the person responsible would finally face justice. Unknown to everyone involved, one silent witness already existed. It rested inside carefully preserved forensic evidence collected from the crime scene in 1984. Scientists could not yet hear what it had to say. Detectives could not yet interpret its message. Families could not imagine that the answer had been waiting quietly all along. The evidence would survive decades inside secure storage while generations of investigators retired, technologies evolved, and entire careers passed into history. The silence surrounding Christine Jessup's murder felt permanent. Yet beneath that silence, hidden inside microscopic traces invisible to the human eye, the truth remained alive, waiting patiently for science to become powerful enough to reveal a name that had escaped justice for nearly 40 years. The discovery of Christine Jessup's body transformed every unanswered question into something heavier, darker, and infinitely more urgent. The search for a missing child had become a race against memory itself. Every hour that passed blurred recollections, weakened witness confidence, and allowed whoever had committed the crime to disappear further into ordinary life. Detectives understood that the first weeks after a homicide often determine its future. If the right lead emerged quickly, an arrest could follow. If it did not, the investigation risked drifting into uncertainty. No one inside the investigative team intended to let that happen. Hundreds of officers were assigned to examine every conceivable angle. Rural roads were retraced repeatedly. Gas stations along major routes were contacted. Businesses reviewed employee schedules. Delivery companies, utility workers, contractors, and seasonal laborers were identified and interviewed if they had been anywhere near Queensville or Sunderland during the relevant period. Maps covered entire walls inside the investigation headquarters, marked with colored pins representing witness sightings, possible vehicle movements, and locations connected to the case. Every detail, no matter how small, became part of an enormous puzzle whose finished image remained invisible. The investigation generated extraordinary public interest. Newspapers devoted front pages to every development. Television crews arrived in communities that had rarely attracted national attention. Reporters interviewed neighbors who struggled to describe the overwhelming shock that had settled over everyday life. Parents no longer viewed familiar streets with comfort. Children who had once walked alone to school or visited friends without supervision suddenly found themselves escorted everywhere. Halloween traditions changed. Evening play disappeared. Trust, once taken for granted in rural Ontario, had been replaced by constant caution. The murder of one child had altered the routines of thousands. With public pressure growing, detectives established specialized interview teams. Rather than relying on a single conversation, many witnesses were questioned multiple times over several weeks. Investigators knew that memory could improve under careful examination, but they also recognized its weaknesses. Traumatic events often distort timelines. People unintentionally combine genuine recollections with information learned later through news reports or conversations with others. Separating authentic observation from reconstructed memory required patience and discipline. Detectives compared statements line by line, searching for consistencies that survived repeated questioning. Occasionally, two witnesses described similar vehicles. Others believed they had seen unfamiliar individuals in the area. Some recalled hearing unusual sounds. Many simply remembered the overwhelming media attention and could no longer distinguish what they had personally witnessed from what they had read in newspapers. Meanwhile, forensic specialists worked meticulously with the physical evidence collected from the crime scene. Every item was cataloged under strict chain of custody procedures. Clothing was preserved. Biological samples were carefully stored. Hair, fibers, plant material, and trace evidence were examined using the most advanced techniques available in the mid-1980s. Laboratory experts searched for fingerprints, blood typing characteristics, and microscopic comparisons that might connect an individual to the crime. But science during that era imposed severe limitations. DNA profiling, the revolutionary tool that would later solve countless cold cases, had not yet become part of routine criminal investigations. Evidence that today might identify an offender with remarkable precision instead yielded only limited forensic information. Detectives possessed pieces of a story without the scientific language needed to read them. Attention increasingly turned toward individuals who had interacted with Christine's family or lived within the surrounding communities. Investigators examined criminal histories, employment records, and personal relationships. Anyone whose behavior appeared unusual after the disappearance attracted scrutiny. Detectives searched for inconsistencies in alibis, unexplained travel, sudden changes in routine, or statements that conflicted with established timelines. Every possible suspect required careful evaluation because eliminating innocent individuals proved just as important as identifying the guilty one. Yet the sheer volume of information threatened to overwhelm even experienced investigators. Thousands of reports accumulated. Every tip generated paperwork. Every interview produced additional names to pursue. As weeks became months, frustration quietly spread through the investigative team. They possessed determination, resources, and public support, yet the central mystery refused to yield. No eyewitness had observed the abduction itself, and no reliable description of an offender emerged. The route between Queensville and Sunderland offered countless opportunities for someone to travel unnoticed. Rural landscapes that appeared peaceful also provided isolation. Fields, wooded areas, gravel roads, and scattered farms created an environment where strangers could move without attracting immediate attention. Detectives reconstructed potential driving routes repeatedly, attempting to estimate how long it would have taken to transport Christine from one location to another. They considered weather conditions, traffic patterns, road quality, and visibility. Every reconstruction ended with multiple possibilities rather than one definitive answer. Community emotions became increasingly volatile. Fear slowly mixed with suspicion. People who had lived beside one another for years suddenly questioned familiar faces. Innocent misunderstandings took on sinister meanings. Ordinary disagreements became exaggerated through rumor. Local conversations often returned to the same haunting question. If an unknown stranger had committed the crime, where had that person gone? But if the killer had remained nearby, could neighbors unknowingly be living alongside someone responsible for unimaginable violence? Such uncertainty placed enormous psychological strain upon entire communities. Investigators repeatedly urged the public not to speculate, yet speculation flourished whenever official answers remained absent. The national media continued following every development with relentless intensity. Experts discussed child safety. Editorials criticized investigative challenges. Television interviews featured criminologists, psychologists, and former police officials offering theories about offender behavior. Public fascination with the case never truly diminished because it represented something deeply unsettling. Crimes involving children often generate extraordinary emotional responses, and Christine's murder became one of the most closely watched investigations in modern Canadian history. Every anniversary renewed public interest. Every statement from police reignited hopes that justice might finally be approaching. Inside the Jessup family, grief settled into daily existence. Funerals mark a single day. Mourning does not. Every birthday became a reminder of the years Christine never experienced. Every family gathering carried the quiet awareness that someone was missing. Ordinary milestones became painful. The passage of time itself became difficult because justice remained absent. Families affected by unsolved homicides often describe living between two worlds, one where life continues, another where the unanswered crime remains permanently frozen in the moment it occurred. That emotional reality gradually became part of the Jessup family's existence. Investigators refused to close the file despite growing obstacles. New tips continued arriving from across Canada. Some callers believed they recognized vehicles mentioned in media reports. Others claimed to have encountered suspicious individuals years earlier. Several reports pointed detectives toward entirely different provinces. Each possibility demanded careful examination. Officers traveled extensively to conduct interviews, verify alibis, and compare information against existing evidence. Most leads dissolved quickly. Some appeared promising before collapsing under closer scrutiny. False confessions, though uncommon, also required investigation. High-profile crimes occasionally attract individuals who falsely claim responsibility for reasons ranging from mental illness to a desire for attention. Detectives evaluated every confession against known forensic facts. None matched the evidence. As the investigation evolved, police developed theories regarding offender behavior. The selection of the disposal site suggested familiarity with rural geography. Transporting the victim over such distance implied access to a vehicle. The absence of immediate identification pointed towards someone capable of avoiding obvious detection. Behavioral analysts considered whether the offender might have committed similar crimes elsewhere. They examined unsolved cases across Canada involving children, searching for comparable methods or patterns. While similarities occasionally appeared, none established a conclusive connection. Behind the scenes, forensic science itself was entering a period of remarkable transformation. During the mid-1980s, researchers in laboratories around the world were beginning to explore techniques capable of distinguishing individuals through unique genetic markers. These early developments seemed revolutionary, but practical implementation remained limited. Most detectives working Christine's case could not have imagined that decades later microscopic biological material preserved from the crime scene might identify an offender with extraordinary precision. At the time, preserving evidence represented professional diligence rather than confidence in future scientific breakthroughs. Yet those careful preservation decisions would ultimately become one of the investigation's greatest strengths. The years immediately following the murder produced moments of cautious optimism. Certain investigative developments appeared encouraging enough to generate renewed public attention. Detectives occasionally believed they were approaching a significant breakthrough. Specific individuals received closer scrutiny than others. Interviews intensified. Search warrants were executed when appropriate. Evidence was compared repeatedly. Every promising avenue seemed capable of delivering the answer Canada desperately wanted, but each ultimately stopped short of certainty. Circumstantial suspicion alone could never substitute for proof. Pressure on investigators remained relentless. Solving Christine Jessup's murder became more than another homicide investigation. It evolved into a symbol of public confidence in the justice system itself. Parents wanted reassurance that crimes against children would not remain unanswered. Police leaders faced difficult decisions regarding resource allocation as months gradually became years. Yet no one wished to abandon the case. Detectives who had spent countless hours examining evidence developed personal commitment far beyond ordinary professional responsibility. They carried photographs. They memorized witness statements. They knew timelines almost by heart. Some later admitted that the case followed them home each evening, refusing to leave their thoughts. Even as active investigative momentum inevitably slowed, the physical evidence remained untouched inside secure storage. Carefully labeled boxes contained clothing, laboratory samples, photographs, notes, diagrams, and forensic exhibits collected with painstaking attention during those first critical months. Those materials represented more than archived documents. They preserved opportunities not yet understood. Science advances regardless of whether criminal investigations keep pace. Techniques impossible in one decade often become routine in the next. Unknown to investigators reviewing paperwork under fluorescent lights, every preserved biological trace quietly waited for a future that would finally allow it to speak. Outside police headquarters, however, the public saw only silence. Headlines became less frequent. Television cameras gradually departed. New tragedies replaced old ones in the national conversation. Yet for Christine's family, the case never became history. Every unanswered question remained painfully current. Somewhere beyond public view, someone knew exactly what had happened on that October afternoon. Someone had lived through every Christmas, every New Year, every passing season carrying knowledge that investigators still lacked. That reality haunted detectives as much as it haunted the family. Because in every unsolved homicide lies an uncomfortable certainty. The truth exists whether investigators have found it or not. The challenge is surviving long enough for that truth to reveal itself. In the Christine Jessup investigation, that revelation would require not months, not years, but an extraordinary combination of persistence, scientific revolution, and the passage of nearly 4 decades before the silence that began in 1984 would finally begin to crack. The investigation refused to disappear, even as the headlines gradually faded from newspaper front pages. Inside filing cabinets, evidence boxes, laboratory reports, interview transcripts, aerial photographs, handwritten notes, and thousands of pages of investigative records continued to grow into one of the largest homicide files in Ontario's history. Every document represented another attempt to answer the same unbearable question: who had taken 9-year-old Christine Jessup? Detectives understood that an unsolved child murder never truly becomes dormant. It simply enters a different phase. The frantic urgency of the first weeks gives way to relentless persistence. New investigators inherit the work of those who retire. Fresh perspectives revisit old assumptions. Every anniversary becomes another reminder that somewhere, someone continues living with the secret. By the late 1980s, the investigation had reached an uncomfortable crossroads. Police had interviewed an extraordinary number of witnesses. They had reconstructed timelines repeatedly. They had examined vehicles, verified alibis, followed anonymous tips, and pursued leads stretching far beyond the quiet roads surrounding Queensville and Sunderland. Yet despite years of effort, no single theory explained every known fact. Each promising lead eventually produced unanswered questions. Detectives often described the case as a puzzle with several pieces that appeared to fit until one critical corner refused to align. It was not the absence of information that made the investigation difficult. It was the absence of certainty. The emotional pressure surrounding the case remained immense. Every public appeal generated new telephone calls. Some callers sincerely believed they possessed important information. Others remembered vague encounters that suddenly seemed suspicious years later. Human memory, however, is fragile. Time does not preserve events perfectly. It reshapes them. Details fade. Conversations merge. Faces become less distinct. investigators knew they had to separate reliable recollections from memories unintentionally influenced by years of media coverage. That task became increasingly complicated with every passing year. Communities throughout Ontario continued discussing Christine's murder. Parents who had been young adults in 1984 were now raising children of their own. Many still remembered the fear that spread after her disappearance. Schools strengthened safety education. Children were encouraged to travel in groups. Families who had once considered rural life naturally secure viewed isolation differently. The case had permanently altered public attitudes toward child safety, long after television cameras moved on. Behind closed doors, detectives continued examining individuals whose names repeatedly surfaced during the investigation. They revisited interviews conducted years earlier, comparing original statements with later conversations. Small inconsistencies received renewed attention: a changed timeline, a forgotten appointment, an uncertain recollection about where someone had been during the afternoon Christine disappeared. Most inconsistencies proved entirely innocent. People rarely remember ordinary days with perfect accuracy, particularly after many years. Nevertheless, investigators understood that even seemingly insignificant contradictions occasionally expose larger truths. At the same time, forensic science around the world was changing rapidly. Laboratories in Europe and North America began demonstrating the remarkable potential of DNA profiling. Criminal cases once dependent almost entirely upon eyewitness testimony suddenly possessed an entirely new investigative tool. Early DNA analysis remained slow, expensive, and technically demanding, but its potential was unmistakable. Biological evidence could now distinguish one individual from another with extraordinary precision. Detectives following developments within forensic science immediately recognized the implications for unresolved homicide investigations. Cases once considered impossible to solve might someday yield answers hidden inside evidence preserved decades earlier. The Christine Jessup investigation was among those quietly waiting for scientific progress. The biological material collected during the original forensic examination remained securely preserved under proper evidence procedures. At the time of collection, no one could have predicted exactly how future technologies would evolve. Yet experienced investigators had insisted that every available exhibit be carefully maintained. That decision reflected both professional discipline and cautious optimism. Good investigators understand that evidence should never be discarded simply because today's science cannot fully analyze it. Tomorrow's science may succeed where today's methods fail. While laboratories advanced, the homicide investigation itself continued moving through difficult territory. Detectives explored multiple theories regarding offender behavior. Did the killer know the area well enough to choose a remote location deliberately? Had Christine been specifically targeted, or had the crime resulted from a chance encounter? Was the offender local, passing through, or someone whose connection to the community remained hidden? Each theory carried strengths and weaknesses. Without definitive forensic identification, no explanation could eliminate all competing possibilities. Public expectation remained relentless. Many people believed that police surely possessed information they had not disclosed. Others assumed the killer must already appear somewhere within the investigative file, overlooked because of insufficient evidence. Such beliefs often emerge in high-profile cases. Reality is usually more complicated. Investigators frequently possess fragments of truth rather than complete narratives. They may suspect certain individuals without possessing evidence capable of supporting criminal charges. They may hold forensic material without technology capable of interpreting it. They may understand parts of a crime while remaining uncertain about its most critical elements. As years passed, personnel inevitably changed. Detectives retired. Supervisors accepted new assignments. Younger investigators inherited files built through thousands of hours of previous work. The transition carried both risks and advantages. Institutional knowledge could be lost, but fresh investigators also approached evidence without emotional attachment to earlier theories. Sometimes they noticed overlooked details. Sometimes they challenged assumptions that had quietly hardened into accepted beliefs. Cold case investigations often benefit from exactly that balance between historical experience and new perspective. Christine's family continued living beneath the weight of uncertainty. Every media anniversary reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Unlike families whose cases end in arrest and conviction, They possessed no courtroom verdict capable of providing even partial closure. Instead, each year simply marked another passage of time without answers. Hope survived, but it changed shape. Rather than expecting immediate justice, the family gradually learned to hope that advances beyond anyone's imagination might someday reveal the truth. By the early 1990s, DNA profiling had become increasingly accepted within criminal investigations. Cases involving biological evidence were now being re-examined across multiple jurisdictions. Laboratories improved extraction techniques. Analysts learned to recover usable genetic material from increasingly limited samples. Scientific publications described remarkable successes in identifying offenders years after crimes occurred. Investigators responsible for unsolved homicides watched these developments closely. Within the Christine Jessup investigation, forensic exhibits were periodically reassessed as technology advanced. Each new generation of testing offered possibilities unavailable before. Yet progress in science rarely follows dramatic leaps. More often, it advances through careful refinement. Samples that once produced incomplete results gradually yielded additional information as laboratory methods improved. Detectives understood that patience remained essential. A single technological breakthrough could completely transform an investigation, but only if evidence had been properly preserved and analyzed according to rigorous standards. Meanwhile, the passage of time affected not only evidence but people. Witnesses moved away. Some died. Others struggled to remember details from events that had occurred years earlier. Physical locations changed. Roads were widened. Buildings disappeared. Trees grew over places once carefully searched. Rural landscapes evolved with new construction and agricultural development. Investigators attempting to recreate events from 1984 increasingly confronted the reality that the world itself had changed around the crime. Yet one fact remained unchanged. Christine Jessup had been murdered. Someone remained responsible. That certainty continued driving investigators despite every setback. Law enforcement agencies also became increasingly aware of the importance of interagency cooperation. Information sharing improved. Databases expanded. Investigators compared unsolved cases across provincial boundaries more systematically than before. Behavioral analysts revisited older homicide files, searching for patterns that earlier investigations, constrained by limited communication systems, may have missed. Although no confirmed connection emerged linking Christine's murder to other known crimes, detectives refused to dismiss any credible possibility without thorough examination. The file itself became almost legendary among investigators. New detectives assigned to homicide units often studied it as an example of both meticulous investigative work and the immense challenges posed by stranger homicides. Every page reflected thousands of professional decisions. Every interview represented another attempt to move closer to justice. The investigation had become more than an active case. It had become a responsibility inherited across generations of police officers. Outside law enforcement, advances in forensic genetics continued accelerating throughout the 1990s. DNA profiling evolved from an emerging technology into one of criminal investigation's most powerful tools. Cortez increasingly accepted genetic evidence. Laboratories reduced processing times. Statistical methods became more sophisticated. Scientific confidence strengthened with every successful application. Around the world, previously unsolved crimes suddenly found answers hidden inside biological evidence collected decades earlier. For investigators following the Christine Jessup case, those developments inspired cautious optimism rather than certainty. They knew the preserved evidence held potential, but potential alone could not solve a homicide. Samples had to remain suitable for testing. Laboratory results had to prove reliable. Any identified individual would require corroboration through careful investigation. Science could point toward truth, but detectives still had to establish the full evidentiary picture. As another decade approached, the silence surrounding Christine's murder remained intact in public view. Headlines appeared less frequently, yet inside police evidence vaults and forensic laboratories, the case had not been forgotten. Quietly, methodically, investigators preserved every opportunity the future might offer. They did not know when the breakthrough would arrive. They did not know whether it would emerge from a witness, a confession, or a scientific innovation still years away. But they understood one lesson shared by experienced homicide investigators everywhere. An unsolved case is never truly finished while evidence remains, while technology advances, and while people continue searching for answers. Somewhere inside the carefully preserved fragments collected during those dark days at the end of 1984, a silent record still existed. It contained no emotions, no rumors, no speculation, only biological fact. One day, when science finally became capable of reading that hidden language with complete confidence, the investigation that had resisted every conventional approach would begin moving in an entirely different direction, one that would force Canada to confront not only the identity of the true offender, but also difficult questions about the investigation itself. The passing years changed almost everything except the unanswered question at the heart of the Christine Jessup investigation. Children who had grown up seeing her photograph on television became adults. Detectives who had walked the fields outside Queensville during those first desperate weeks retired from active service. Police vehicles were replaced with newer models. Communication systems evolved from paper files and landline telephones to computerized databases capable of sharing information across jurisdictions in seconds. Entire generations entered law enforcement knowing the case only through photographs, evidence logs, and interview transcripts assembled long before they joined the profession. Yet despite the passage of time, one fact refused to fade. Somewhere, someone had taken the life of a 9-year-old girl in October 1984, and the truth still existed whether investigators had found it or not. Cold cases occupy a unique place within criminal investigations. Unlike active emergencies, they unfold against time rather than immediate danger. The offender is no longer racing to escape capture. Instead, investigators race against fading memories, lost witnesses, deteriorating evidence, and the simple reality that every passing year removes another opportunity to recover information. Yet paradoxically, time can also become an ally. Scientific breakthroughs occur. New investigative methods emerge. People once unwilling to speak sometimes decide differently decades later. Relationships change. Loyalties disappear. Fear weakens. Cases once considered impossible occasionally reopen, not because investigators made a mistake, but because the world itself changed around them. That possibility quietly sustained those responsible for preserving the Christine Jessup file. Every exhibit remained carefully documented. Biological samples collected in 1984 continued to be stored under conditions designed to protect their integrity. Investigators understood that preserving evidence required patience measured not in weeks or months, but sometimes in generations. Each time forensic laboratories announced improvements in DNA technology, detectives revisited the possibility that another examination might reveal something previous testing could not. The science was advancing with remarkable speed. During the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA analysis became increasingly sensitive. Laboratories learned to extract usable genetic profiles from smaller and more degraded samples than had once seemed possible. Statistical interpretation improved dramatically. National DNA databases strengthened investigative capabilities by allowing biological evidence from crime scenes to be compared against known offender profiles under carefully regulated legal frameworks. Around the world, long unsolved murders began reaching unexpected conclusions as preserved evidence finally yielded names that had remained hidden for decades. Investigators assigned to the Jessup case watched these developments closely. Every improvement offered another opportunity to examine the evidence using techniques unavailable during earlier testing. However, science rarely provides immediate miracles. Some samples produced only partial information. Others required more advanced laboratory procedures that did not yet exist. Detectives learned to balance optimism with realism. A technological advance meant little unless the evidence itself remained capable of supporting meaningful analysis. Meanwhile, the public memory of Christine's murder evolved in a different direction. The case became one of Canada's most recognized unsolved child homicides. Documentary programs revisited the investigation. Newspapers marked anniversaries with detailed retrospectives. Journalists interviewed retired investigators, forensic experts, and members of the community who still remembered the fear that swept across rural Ontario during the autumn of 1984. Each anniversary revived the same painful questions. Could the case still be solved? Did police possess evidence unknown to the public? Was the killer still alive? For Christine's family, those questions never disappeared. Every media interview required revisiting memories that remained as painful as ever. Decades do not erase grief. They simply teach people how to carry it. Families living through unresolved homicide investigations often describe existing between hope and resignation. Hope that justice remains possible. Resignation that it may never arrive. The Jessup family continued to support efforts aimed at finding the truth, knowing that every scientific advance represented another chance, however uncertain, that the investigation might finally move forward. Within police services, specialized cold case units increasingly demonstrated their value. These teams differed from original investigative squads in important ways. They approached historical cases without the urgency of immediate response, allowing them to conduct systematic reviews of every document, every forensic exhibit, and every witness statement. They benefited from decades of accumulated investigative experience, modern analytical tools, and improved forensic capabilities. Rather than assuming earlier investigators had overlooked obvious clues, cold case detectives focused on asking new questions using methods unavailable at the time. The Christine Jessup investigation became exactly the type of case that benefited from such long-term reassessment. Thousands of pages of reports were reviewed again. Witness statements were compared against newer timelines. Physical evidence was evaluated according to modern forensic standards. Detectives carefully examined whether any preserved biological material could now undergo more advanced DNA analysis than had previously been possible. Every decision required meticulous attention because the integrity of historical evidence depended upon strict adherence to scientific protocols developed over decades. The remarkable aspect of cold case investigations is that they often involve to separate timelines unfolding simultaneously. One timeline belongs to the crime itself, fixed forever in the past. The other belongs to science, continually moving forward. As technology improves, yesterday's unanswered questions sometimes receive tomorrow's solutions. Detectives responsible for preserving historical evidence understand this better than anyone. They know that a sample appearing scientifically insignificant today may become critically important 10 years later. Across North America, investigators increasingly witnessed exactly that phenomenon. Old homicide files once considered unsolvable began reaching courtrooms after advanced DNA testing identified offenders with extraordinary certainty. Families who had waited decades finally received long-awaited answers. These successes encouraged law enforcement agencies to revisit additional cold cases, including those involving preserved biological evidence collected long before DNA became part of routine criminal investigation. Inside forensic laboratories, analysts continued refining methods capable of extracting genetic information from increasingly difficult samples. Improvements in amplification techniques, contamination controls, and profile interpretation expanded possibilities unimaginable during the 1980s. Cases that once produced inconclusive laboratory findings could now yield far more complete genetic information. Scientists remained cautious, however. Every conclusion required rigorous validation. DNA evidence possesses tremendous investigative power only when handled according to exacting scientific standards. The Jessup investigation quietly entered this new scientific era. Evidence collected from the crime scene underwent additional forensic evaluation as laboratory capabilities advanced. Detectives understood that each new analysis represented another opportunity, not merely to identify an offender, but to eliminate uncertainty that had surrounded the investigation for years. Scientific evidence carries a unique quality. Unlike witness memory, it does not become influenced by publicity. Unlike rumor, it does not change through repetition. It remains constant, waiting only for technology capable of interpreting it accurately. Years passed without dramatic public announcements. To outside observers, the case appeared unchanged. There were no sensational press conferences, no sudden arrests, no dramatic revelations. Yet beneath the surface, careful work continued. Investigators preserved chain of custody records, coordinated with forensic experts, and maintained communication with prosecutors regarding potential future developments. Cold case investigations often progress almost invisibly until one critical breakthrough suddenly changes everything. During this period, broader conversations about forensic science also emerged within Canada's justice system. Advances in DNA technology demonstrated not only the ability to identify guilty individuals, but also the capacity to eliminate suspicion from innocent people. Cases across multiple jurisdictions illustrated that biological evidence could correct investigative errors, clarify uncertainty, and provide objective answers where conflicting testimony existed. This growing understanding reinforced the importance of preserving evidence indefinitely whenever possible. Detectives assigned to historical investigations increasingly recognized that justice required patience as much as persistence. Some cases remained unresolved because essential technology simply had not existed when the crimes occurred. Rather than viewing those investigations as failures, experienced officers came to understand them as unfinished work awaiting future scientific assistance. Christine Jessup's murder stood among the clearest examples. Every anniversary reminded investigators how much time had passed. 10 years, 15, 20. The evidence itself remained silent. But silence does not necessarily indicate absence. It often reflects limitation. Throughout those decades, forensic scientists continued developing methods capable of revealing information once considered permanently inaccessible. Each advancement narrowed the distance between preserved biological traces and identifiable individuals. Some detectives privately believed that if the case were ever solved, DNA would almost certainly play the decisive role. Others remained cautious, knowing that laboratory success could never be guaranteed. Biological samples degrade. Contamination risks exist. Historical evidence presents unique challenges absent from newly collected material. Yet optimism persisted because the original forensic team had exercised remarkable care in preserving every available exhibit. Decisions made during those first days after Christine's body was discovered continued protecting investigative opportunities decades later. Outside police headquarters, life continued. Roads were repaved. Farms changed ownership. Children born after 1984 grew into adults who knew Christine Jessup only through documentaries, newspaper archives, and discussions about Canada's most enduring cold cases. Few could imagine that inside secure evidence storage facilities, microscopic biological material collected from the original crime scene still waited. It had survived political changes, technological revolutions, organizational restructuring, and the retirement of countless investigators. It remained exactly what it had always been, a silent witness preserving biological truth. Eventually, that silent witness would encounter a generation of forensic science capable of hearing what earlier investigators could not. The transformation would not arrive through luck alone. It would emerge from decades of meticulous evidence preservation, relentless scientific progress, and investigators who refused to abandon the possibility that even after nearly 40 years, the truth could still be recovered. When that moment finally came, it would not simply identify a name. It would reshape public understanding of one of Canada's most haunting murder investigations and demonstrate that time, no matter how long, cannot always protect the truth from being discovered. As the first decade of the 21st century unfolded, the Christine Jessup investigation occupied a strange place within Canadian criminal history. It was no longer an active crime scene surrounded by police tape or television cameras broadcasting urgent updates. Instead, it had become something equally powerful: a symbol. Police academies discussed it when teaching the importance of evidence preservation. Journalists referenced it whenever another child disappeared. Families of victims in other unsolved cases looked toward it with cautious hope, believing that if science continued advancing, perhaps their own unanswered questions might someday receive answers as well. Yet inside the official investigative files, hope remained grounded not in emotion but in procedure. Every review had to be methodical. Every laboratory request required justification. Every conclusion demanded evidence capable of surviving the highest legal scrutiny. The evolution of forensic DNA technology during these years transformed homicide investigations around the world. Scientists no longer viewed biological evidence simply as material for comparison between a suspect and a crime scene. Instead, genetic material itself became a source of identity. Improvements in extraction techniques allowed analysts to recover usable DNA from increasingly small, degraded, or decades-old samples. Laboratories refined methods to eliminate contamination, interpret complex mixtures, and generate profiles with statistical confidence unimaginable during the 1980s. Investigators who had once relied primarily upon interviews and circumstantial evidence suddenly possessed a tool capable of answering questions that witnesses never could. Across North America, Cold cases that had remained unsolved for 20, 30, even 40 years began reaching extraordinary conclusions. Offenders who believed time had erased their crimes found themselves identified through biological evidence preserved long before DNA profiling became routine. Families who had spent decades living with uncertainty suddenly received telephone calls they had almost stopped believing would ever come. Detectives watched these developments carefully. Every successful case reinforced the same lesson. If evidence had been properly preserved, the passage of time no longer guaranteed safety for those responsible. The Christine Jessup investigation stood among the cases most likely to benefit from these scientific advances. Investigators knew that biological evidence collected during the original forensic examination still existed. Earlier testing had already demonstrated its potential value, but each new generation of laboratory techniques promised greater sensitivity and more complete analysis. Detectives worked closely with forensic specialists to determine whether additional testing could produce information unavailable during previous examinations. Such decisions required patience. Historical evidence cannot be repeatedly tested without considering preservation, available technology, and the possibility that future methods may prove even more effective. Cold case investigations rarely produce dramatic moments visible to the public. Instead, they advance quietly through countless small decisions. A laboratory agrees to reevaluate historical samples using newly validated procedures. An investigator reviews interview notes with fresh perspective. A forensic scientist notices an opportunity created by recent technological improvements. Progress often occurs one careful step at a time, invisible outside police headquarters until months or years later. During these years, investigators also revisited every aspect of the original case chronology. Modern analytical software made it easier to organize timelines, compare witness statements, and identify inconsistencies hidden within thousands of pages of documentation. Geographic information systems allowed investigators to reconstruct travel routes with far greater precision than maps available during the mid-1980s. Although technology could not replace traditional detective work, it significantly improved the ability to visualize relationships among locations, times, and investigative findings. The community surrounding Queensville had changed dramatically since 1984. New homes stood where open fields once stretched toward the horizon. Roads carried heavier traffic. Families had moved away, while others arrived with little knowledge of the tragedy that had once defined the area. Yet for longtime residents, memories remained vivid. Many could still recall search parties moving across farmland. Others remembered helicopters circling overhead or volunteers gathering before sunrise hoping to find Christine alive. Those memories never fully disappeared. They became part of the community's shared history. Christine's family continued waiting with extraordinary resilience. Decades without answers create a unique form of endurance. Every public anniversary reopened old wounds while simultaneously reminding the nation that justice remained unfinished. Families living through unresolved homicide investigations often describe time as moving in two different directions. The calendar continues advancing, yet emotionally part of life remains permanently connected to the day everything changed. For the Jessup family, October 1984 never truly became the past. Meanwhile, forensic scientists increasingly recognized another remarkable truth. DNA evidence possessed value beyond immediate suspect identification. It could also eliminate individuals from consideration with objective certainty. This characteristic fundamentally changed investigative philosophy. Cases burdened by years of speculation could now be reassessed through biological evidence rather than assumptions, rumors, or imperfect recollections. Detectives understood that identifying the true offender also required ensuring that no innocent person remained under unjustified suspicion. Throughout Canada and internationally, discussions about cold case methodology emphasized collaboration between detectives and forensic laboratories. Successful historical investigations depended upon preserving evidence, documenting chain of custody, and maintaining detailed records explaining how every exhibit had been collected, stored, and examined. The Christine Jessup investigation benefited enormously from the professionalism displayed during those first critical days after the crime. Although investigators in 1984 could not foresee modern DNA analysis, they had nevertheless preserved evidence according to standards that would eventually make advanced testing possible. Years passed without public breakthroughs, but inside forensic laboratories, important work continued. Analysts developed increasingly sophisticated methods for recovering genetic material from historical evidence. Validation studies confirmed reliability. International scientific collaboration accelerated improvements. Cases once considered beyond forensic recovery gradually became candidates for renewed examination. Every technological advance narrowed the gap between unanswered questions and scientifically supported conclusions. Detectives responsible for historical homicide files often describe an unusual relationship with patients. Active investigations demand immediate action. Cold cases demand disciplined restraint. Every new development must be carefully evaluated because premature conclusions risk damaging years of work. Investigators therefore learn to celebrate small progress rather than dramatic announcements. A successful DNA extraction, an improved laboratory result, a newly available analytical technique, each represented another step toward truth, even if the destination remained uncertain. Public fascination with the Christine Jessup case never entirely disappeared. Investigative documentaries revisited the evidence. Journalists interviewed retired detectives about the extraordinary complexity of the investigation. Experts discussed advances in forensic science that might someday provide answers. Viewers across Canada wondered whether the mystery would ever be solved or whether it would remain one of the country's most heartbreaking unsolved child murders. Few realized how much careful work continued behind the scenes. Inside secure evidence facilities, biological samples remained remarkably important despite their microscopic size. They represented something unique among all investigative materials. Witnesses could forget. Records could be misinterpreted. Public opinion could shift dramatically over decades. Biological evidence remained constant. It preserved facts independent of memory or emotion. Scientists needed only the appropriate technology to reveal what had always been present. By the late 2000s and into the following decade, confidence within forensic genetics had reached unprecedented levels. Laboratories demonstrated remarkable accuracy when analyzing preserved biological evidence from historical crimes. Improvements in DNA profiling allowed investigators to distinguish between contributors with increasing precision. Statistical calculations supporting identifications became extraordinarily robust. Courts around the world accepted properly conducted DNA evidence as one of the most reliable forms of forensic identification available. For detectives reviewing the Jessup file, these developments inspired renewed determination. The investigation had survived because earlier generations refused to discard evidence or abandon hope. Every detective who inherited the case understood that they were temporary custodians of a search extending across decades. Their responsibility was not merely to solve a crime, but to preserve every opportunity for future investigators to succeed if current methods still proved insufficient. The philosophy guiding cold case work had fundamentally changed. Investigators no longer asked whether historical evidence might someday become useful. Experience had already answered that question. Instead, they asked what additional scientific advances might still lie ahead. If DNA technology had progressed so dramatically since 1984, what might become possible in another 5 years? Another 10? Such thinking required unusual humility. Detectives accepted that future scientists might accomplish what present-day investigators could not. Behind every laboratory request stood the same quiet hope. Somewhere inside the preserved biological evidence collected after Christine's murder remained an objective record of the individual responsible. That record had survived untouched while decades passed outside laboratory walls. The offender, whoever he was, had continued living through changing governments, technological revolutions, and an entirely new century. He may have believed that the investigation belonged permanently to history. He may have assumed that memories had faded beyond recovery. He may even have believed that the absence of an arrest meant the danger had passed forever. But science was moving steadily toward him. Not through dramatic police raids or anonymous informants. Not through chance confessions or accidental discoveries. Through molecules preserved in silence since 1984, waiting patiently for forensic technology capable of reading the story they had carried from the very beginning. Investigators did not yet know whose name that story would reveal. They did not know how profoundly its discovery would reshape public understanding of the case. They knew only that every advancement in forensic genetics brought the investigation closer to a moment many had once considered impossible, a moment when nearly 4 decades of unanswered questions would finally begin giving way to evidence that neither time nor memory could alter. The breakthrough did not arrive with flashing lights, dramatic arrests, or a witness walking unexpectedly into a police station. It emerged exactly as many of the investigators had quietly hoped it would inside a forensic laboratory, through the careful application of science to evidence that had been preserved since the autumn of 1984. There was no single instant when decades of uncertainty simply vanished. Instead, the investigation began to shift almost imperceptibly. New laboratory techniques made it possible to extract and analyze biological material with a level of precision unimaginable when Christine Jessup was murdered. What had once appeared to be only fragments of forensic evidence now possessed the potential to answer questions that had survived nearly 40 years. Detectives understood immediately that they were entering the most significant phase of the investigation since the original crime scene examination. Every step required extraordinary caution. Historical evidence carries immense value precisely because there is so little of it. Forensic scientists approach the preserved exhibits under strict laboratory conditions designed to prevent contamination and ensure the reliability of every result. Procedures were documented in meticulous detail. Independent verification remained essential. Any conclusion drawn from the testing would eventually have to withstand the highest scientific and legal scrutiny. This was not simply another laboratory exercise. It involved one of Canada's most well-known unsolved child murders, a case followed for decades by investigators, journalists, legal experts, and the public. The detectives assigned to the cold case understood that modern forensic science could identify biological contributors with remarkable accuracy, but DNA alone could not explain an entire crime. Laboratory findings would need to be integrated with historical investigative records, witness statements, timelines, and all the evidence accumulated since 1984. The goal was never simply to generate a genetic profile. The goal was to reconstruct the truth with complete confidence. As scientists continued their work, investigators reopened boxes that had not been examined in years. Original crime scene photographs were reviewed alongside updated forensic reports. Handwritten notes prepared by detectives during the first days of the investigation were compared with digital databases now capable of organizing enormous amounts of information almost instantly. Every decision made decades earlier was revisited not because investigators believed those decisions had necessarily been wrong, but because modern science allowed familiar evidence to be viewed through an entirely different lens. The importance of preservation became increasingly clear. Every carefully sealed evidence package, every chain of custody record, every laboratory log completed in 1984 contributed directly to the integrity of the renewed investigation. Detectives often reflected that the officers working the original crime scene could never have imagined exactly how forensic genetics would evolve. Yet their professional discipline had ensured that future investigators inherited evidence capable of benefiting from scientific advances that did not yet exist. The renewed forensic work also illustrated an important truth about cold cases. Time does not erase biological evidence in the same way it erodes memory. Witnesses grow older. Conversations become difficult to recall. Landscapes change. Buildings disappear. But properly preserved DNA remains remarkably stable, waiting for technology capable of interpreting it more completely than before. In many ways, the evidence collected in 1984 had remained frozen while the rest of the world changed around it. Investigators coordinated closely with forensic specialists throughout the review process. Laboratory findings were never interpreted in isolation. Every scientific result generated new investigative questions. Could the genetic profile be compared against available databases? Did historical records identify individuals connected to the investigation whose biological samples might require comparison? Were there investigative avenues unavailable during earlier decades that modern forensic information now made possible? Each answer led carefully toward another question. Outside police headquarters, the public remained largely unaware of the quiet progress occurring behind the scenes. Cold case investigations rarely produce continuous media coverage because responsible investigators avoid discussing incomplete forensic work publicly. Premature announcements risk misunderstanding, unnecessary speculation, and potential legal complications. Consequently, while newspaper readers occasionally encountered anniversary articles about Christine Jessup's murder, few realized that the investigation itself was entering in an entirely new scientific era. Christine's family continued waiting without knowing exactly where the renewed forensic examination might lead. They had lived through countless moments of cautious optimism over the decades. Promising investigative developments had appeared before, only to dissolve under closer examination. Experience had taught them that hope required patience. Every new review carried possibility, but certainty would come only through evidence capable of surviving rigorous scrutiny. Within the forensic community, however, confidence in DNA science had reached extraordinary levels. Analysts understood both the power and the limitations of genetic evidence. DNA could establish biological connections with exceptional precision. It could identify individuals or eliminate them from consideration. But responsible scientists also recognized that forensic results must always be interpreted within the broader context of an investigation. Biological evidence answers certain questions with remarkable clarity while leaving others for detectives to resolve through traditional investigative methods. The Christine Jessup case demanded exactly that balance. Detectives carefully integrated modern laboratory findings with decades of accumulated investigative work. Every timeline was reconsidered. Every significant interview received renewed attention. Historical evidence once viewed as inconclusive gained new relevance when examined alongside advanced forensic analysis. The investigation was no longer simply reviewing old information. It was gradually transforming historical evidence into an entirely new understanding of the crime. Across Canada, similar developments in other cold cases reinforced the value of persistence. Investigators increasingly recognized that scientific progress had fundamentally changed the meaning of an unsolved homicide. Cases once considered permanently unresolved could now re-enter active investigation whenever forensic capabilities improved. The passage of time no longer favored offenders as reliably as it once had. Instead, every advancement in laboratory science increased the possibility that preserved evidence might eventually reveal the truth. Detectives assigned to historical investigations frequently spoke about justice as a long-term commitment rather than an immediate outcome. Their responsibility extended beyond solving crimes during their own careers. They preserved evidence, maintained investigative files, and documented decisions so that future generations could continue the search if necessary. The Christine Jessup investigation represented perhaps the clearest example of that philosophy. Dozens of investigators across multiple decades had contributed to the same objective without knowing whether they themselves would ever witness its conclusion. As forensic analysis continued, investigators became increasingly aware that they were approaching answers unavailable to every previous generation assigned to the case. The biological evidence preserved since 1984 had survived precisely long enough to encounter technology capable of revealing its hidden information. Every laboratory report narrowed uncertainty. Every verified result strengthened confidence that objective scientific evidence, not rumor, speculation, or fading memory, would ultimately determine the direction of the investigation. The renewed work also highlighted another important reality. Advances in forensic genetics do not simply solve crimes. They can fundamentally reshape understanding of historical investigations. Evidence interpreted under older scientific limitations may appear very different when viewed through modern analytical techniques. Investigators therefore approached every conclusion with professional humility, recognizing that science continues evolving and that objective evidence must always take precedence over assumptions formed years earlier. By this stage, the investigation had become a remarkable collaboration across generations. Detectives who had searched Ontario fields in 1984, forensic specialists who preserved biological evidence despite limited technology, laboratory scientists developing advanced DNA techniques decades later, and modern cold case investigators reviewing historical records all contributed to the same search for truth. None of them alone could have solved the case. Together, separated by decades but connected through meticulous professional work, they created the possibility that justice might finally become attainable. Yet, despite growing optimism within the investigative team, one critical question remained unanswered. Scientific evidence was steadily revealing biological facts, but identifying the individual connected to those facts required additional investigative steps. Detectives knew they were closer than ever before, but they also understood that extraordinary cases demand extraordinary care. Every conclusion would eventually affect not only the Jessup family, but public confidence in one of Canada's longest-running homicide investigations. The silence that had begun on that October afternoon in 1984 was finally beginning to break, not through rumor, not through chance, but through evidence that had waited nearly 40 years for science to catch up with the truth it had quietly preserved all along. The investigation now stood on the threshold of a discovery that would alter the history of the case forever. What investigators were about to learn would not simply answer the question of who had left biological evidence behind. It would compel Canada to confront the extraordinary consequences of a murder investigation stretching across generations, where the most powerful witness had never spoken a single word until science finally learned how to listen. The closer investigators moved toward the truth, the more carefully every step had to be measured. Cold case breakthroughs are often portrayed as dramatic moments in which a single laboratory result instantly identifies an offender. In reality is far more deliberate. A DNA profile, no matter how compelling, becomes only the beginning of a new phase of investigation. Detectives must determine how that profile fits within the historical evidence, whether it can be independently verified, and whether every conclusion withstands the highest legal and scientific standards. In the Christine Jessup investigation, the renewed forensic analysis did exactly what investigators had hoped for decades. It opened a path that had never before existed, but it also required extraordinary patience before any public announcement could be made. Forensic specialists continued examining the preserved biological evidence using methods that represented the culmination of decades of scientific progress. Each laboratory procedure was carefully documented. Independent reviews confirmed the reliability of the findings. Investigators understood that after nearly 40 years, there could be no room for uncertainty. Every scientific conclusion would inevitably be scrutinized by courts, legal experts, independent scientists, journalists, and the Canadian public. The integrity of the investigation depended upon absolute precision. As the forensic work advanced, detectives simultaneously revisited every historical aspect of the case. Original witness interviews were reread with fresh eyes. Geographic reconstructions were updated using modern mapping technology. Timelines were refined to reflect everything investigators had learned over the previous decades. What had once appeared to be isolated pieces of information gradually began fitting together more clearly. Some details that had seemed insignificant during the 1980s acquired entirely new importance when viewed alongside the emerging forensic evidence. The remarkable aspect of long-term homicide investigations is that they often become collaborations between generations who never meet one another. Detectives who searched for Christine in 1984 could not have imagined the laboratory techniques now available. The forensic scientists conducting modern DNA analysis had not participated in the original crime scene investigation. Cold case investigators inherited thousands of pages of reports prepared by officers who had long since retired. Yet every individual contributed something essential. The original investigators preserved evidence with exceptional care. Successive detectives protected the integrity of the file. Scientists developed increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. Together, across nearly 4 decades, they built the foundation for a breakthrough no single generation could have achieved alone. The investigation also demonstrated the extraordinary value of institutional memory. Although personnel changed repeatedly over the years, meticulous documentation ensured that important investigative decisions remained understandable to future teams. Every exhibit retained its chain of custody. Every laboratory examination was recorded. Every witness interview remained preserved within the case file. Cold case investigations succeed not simply because science advances, but because earlier investigators leave behind records detailed enough for future detectives to continue the work without losing its historical context. Throughout this period, police maintained strict confidentiality. Investigators recognized that premature disclosure could compromise ongoing forensic work or generate unnecessary speculation. Public silence should never be mistaken for investigative inactivity. In reality, some of the most significant developments in major criminal cases occur quietly inside laboratories, conference rooms, and evidence facilities, long before anyone outside law enforcement becomes aware that progress has been made. For Christine's family, however, every passing month carried familiar uncertainty. They had experienced decades of hope followed by disappointment. Investigative reviews had come and gone. Scientific developments had raised expectations before proving insufficient to resolve the case completely. They understood better than anyone that genuine breakthroughs reveal themselves only when supported by unquestionable evidence. Until then, patience remained their only choice. Within Canada's forensic community, confidence in advanced DNA analysis continued strengthening. Historical homicide investigations increasingly demonstrated that biological evidence could survive decades when properly preserved. Cases once considered permanently unsolved began reaching definitive conclusions through laboratory techniques unavailable when the crimes originally occurred. Each success reinforced the importance of retaining evidence indefinitely whenever practical. The Christine Jessup investigation stood as one of the most important examples of why that commitment mattered. Investigators carefully considered every possible explanation for the emerging forensic findings. Responsible detective work requires testing alternative hypotheses rather than accepting convenient conclusions. Could the biological evidence have an innocent explanation? Did historical records support or contradict the laboratory results? Were there additional investigative steps necessary before drawing final conclusions? Every question received detailed examination because objective truth, not speed, remained the ultimate goal. Modern forensic science possesses extraordinary power, but experienced investigators understand its limits. DNA can identify biological contributors with remarkable accuracy. It cannot, by itself, explain every circumstance surrounding a crime. Detectives therefore combined scientific evidence with traditional investigative techniques. They reviewed historical records, analyzed movements, examined relationships, and reconstructed events as completely as possible. The result was not merely a laboratory conclusion, but a comprehensive understanding supported by multiple sources of evidence. As investigators moved closer to identifying the individual connected to the preserved biological material, they also recognized the broader significance of the case. Christine Jessup's murder had influenced Canadian policing, forensic science, and public awareness for decades. The eventual resolution would extend far beyond one criminal investigation. It would demonstrate what persistence, careful evidence preservation, and scientific advancement could accomplish when combined across generations. The media remained largely unaware of the extent of progress occurring behind closed doors. Anniversary articles continued describing the case as one of Canada's enduring unsolved child murders. Documentary programs revisited familiar photographs, interviews, and historical footage. Viewers saw a mystery that appeared frozen in time. Investigators, however, understood that the case was no longer standing still. Quietly, methodically, it was moving toward a conclusion built not upon speculation, but upon increasingly compelling forensic evidence. Cold case detectives often describe their work as conversations with the past. Every document, every photograph, every preserved exhibit represents a message left by earlier investigators. Their responsibility is to interpret those messages using tools unavailable when they were first created. The Christine Jessup investigation embodied that philosophy perfectly. The original crime scene had long since disappeared. Witness memories had faded. The landscape itself had changed. Yet the preserved evidence continued speaking with extraordinary clarity once science learned how to interpret its language. Throughout the review process, investigators remained acutely aware of their obligation to accuracy. Public confidence in the justice system depended not simply upon solving historical crimes, but upon solving them correctly. Every forensic result underwent careful verification. Every investigative conclusion required independent support wherever possible. The objective was never merely to identify someone associated with the evidence. The objective was to establish the truth beyond reasonable doubt according to the highest professional standards. By now, nearly 40 years had passed since Christine left her home expecting to visit a friend. Entire generations had grown up knowing her story only through news reports and documentaries. Many Canadians believed the mystery might never be solved. Yet inside secure evidence facilities and forensic laboratories, the preserved biological traces collected in 1984 continued revealing information with increasing precision. Time had failed to erase them. Instead, it had allowed science to mature until the evidence could finally be understood in ways unimaginable during the original investigation. Detectives who dedicated years to the case often reflected upon the extraordinary patience required by justice. Unlike ordinary investigations measured in days or weeks, this one unfolded across careers. Officers who began searching for Christine eventually retired before witnessing the results of scientific advances that would fundamentally reshape the case. Younger investigators inherited responsibilities extending far beyond their own professional timelines. Success became a shared achievement belonging to everyone who refused to let the evidence be forgotten. The investigation was now approaching a moment unlike any other in its history. The forensic evidence was no longer simply preserving possibility. It was pointing investigators toward a specific truth. Before that truth could be presented publicly, every remaining question had to be answered with the same care that had characterized the investigation from the very beginning. Detectives understood that what came next would not merely identify the person responsible according to modern forensic science. It would also require Canada to examine the remarkable journey of a homicide investigation that had survived nearly 4 decades, proving that while time can conceal the truth, it cannot always protect it forever. The investigation had now reached a point that earlier generations of detectives could scarcely have imagined. For decades, the Christine Jessup file had been defined by uncertainty. Every promising lead had eventually dissolved. Every theory had encountered unanswered questions. Every anniversary had served as another reminder that the truth remained beyond reach. But the renewed forensic examination was changing the nature of the investigation itself. Detectives were no longer searching blindly through thousands of possibilities. They were following objective scientific evidence that had remained hidden inside preserved biological material since 1984. The pace of the investigation remained deliberate, but its direction had become far more focused than at any time since Christine disappeared. The significance of that transformation extended well beyond a single criminal case. It represented the culmination of nearly 4 decades of scientific evolution. When Christine was murdered, DNA profiling had not yet become part of routine criminal investigation. Detectives relied upon eyewitness testimony, physical evidence visible to the naked eye, interviews, and painstaking reconstruction of events. Those methods remained essential, but they possessed limitations, particularly in stranger homicides where reliable witnesses were scarce. The evidence collected from the crime scene had always contained information unavailable to investigators in 1984. The science simply had not yet existed to reveal it. Modern forensic laboratories changed that reality. Years of research had produced techniques capable of recovering genetic information from biological samples once considered too limited for meaningful analysis. Improvements in amplification, contamination control, quality assurance, and statistical interpretation allowed forensic scientists to examine historical evidence with extraordinary sensitivity. Every advancement increased the possibility that unresolved investigations could finally move beyond speculation toward objective identification. Inside the laboratory, however, science proceeded with remarkable discipline. Every conclusion required verification. Analysts repeated procedures when necessary. Independent reviews confirmed findings before investigators relied upon them. Historical evidence demands exceptional care because there is often only one opportunity to perform certain analyses. Detectives understood that the credibility of the entire investigation depended upon scientific rigor rather than speed. After waiting nearly 40 years, there was no reason to rush the final stages. As forensic findings accumulated, investigators carefully compared the emerging evidence with the historical case file. Every relevant interview conducted during previous decades was reconsidered. Every documented movement, timeline, and investigative decision received renewed examination. Detectives were not attempting to rewrite history. They were attempting to understand it more completely through information unavailable to earlier investigators. In many respects, the investigation became a dialogue between past and present. The meticulous work performed in 1984 now intersected with scientific capabilities developed decades later. The cold case team also appreciated an important lesson demonstrated repeatedly throughout forensic history. Scientific evidence often answers questions investigators did not originally know how to ask. Earlier detectives had preserved biological samples because professional standards required thorough evidence collection. They could not have predicted precisely what future laboratories might discover. Yet their commitment to preserving every possible exhibit ensured that the investigation remained capable of benefiting from technological advances far beyond their own era. Publicly, little appeared to change. Media organizations occasionally revisited the case during significant anniversaries, describing it as one of Canada's most haunting unsolved child murders. Journalists interviewed former investigators, legal experts, and members of the community who still remembered the fear surrounding Christine's disappearance. Most observers assumed the investigation remained largely unchanged, progressing only through occasional reviews and renewed appeals for information. Very few realized that behind closed doors, forensic science was quietly reshaping the case. For Christine's family, the passage of time had created an emotional landscape unlike anything most people experience. Decades had passed without answers, yet grief remained connected to the moment everything changed. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary family gatherings all carried the silent absence of a child who never returned home. Families enduring unresolved homicide investigations often speak of living with two parallel realities. One follows the calendar. The other remains permanently anchored to the day the crime occurred. The Jessup family had lived within those parallel realities for nearly 4 decades. Investigators remained deeply aware that solving a homicide involves more than identifying a biological contributor. Every investigative conclusion must fit coherently within the established facts. Scientific evidence provides remarkable precision, but detectives still bear responsibility for understanding how that evidence relates to the broader sequence of events. They carefully examined every available record to ensure that laboratory findings aligned with historical documentation, known timelines, and physical evidence collected during the original investigation. The remarkable preservation of the case file played an essential role. Every photograph, sketch, evidence log, witness statement, and forensic report remained available for review. Cold case investigations often succeed because earlier investigators documented their work with extraordinary care. The Christine Jessup investigation demonstrated that principle perfectly. Detectives separated by decades could collaborate indirectly through records prepared years apart, each generation contributing knowledge impossible for the others to possess. Across North America, similar historical investigations continued illustrating the transformative impact of forensic genetics. Cases once considered permanently unsolved reached definitive conclusions after decades of silence. Families received long-awaited answers. Communities confronted truths hidden for generations. These successes reinforced a profound shift within law enforcement. Time was no longer viewed solely as an obstacle. Properly preserved evidence allowed time itself to become an investigative resource because scientific capabilities continued, improving year after year. Within Canada's justice system, confidence in advanced DNA analysis had become firmly established. Laboratories operated under rigorous accreditation standards. Validation studies confirmed the reliability of forensic methodologies. Cortez increasingly recognized DNA evidence as among the most objective forms of scientific identification available when collected, preserved, and analyzed according to proper procedures. Detectives responsible for the Jessup investigation understood that their case now rested upon exactly those principles. Yet despite growing confidence, experienced investigators remained cautious. High-profile historical cases demand exceptional professionalism. Every document would eventually receive careful examination. Every forensic conclusion would be scrutinized by defense counsel, prosecutors, independent experts, journalists, and the public. Investigators therefore resisted the temptation to celebrate prematurely. They continued methodically confirming every aspect of the renewed investigation before any official announcement could be considered. The broader significance of the case also became increasingly apparent. Christine Jessup's murder had influenced generations of Canadian investigators, forensic scientists, and child protection advocates. It had become one of the country's defining cold cases, illustrating both the immense challenges of stranger homicides and the extraordinary potential of long-term evidence preservation. Whatever conclusions ultimately emerged would shape public understanding not only of this investigation, but of cold case work more generally. Inside the investigative team, there was growing recognition that they were approaching the final chapter of a story that had begun in October 1984. The biological evidence preserved through decades of careful handling had survived long enough to encounter science capable of revealing its hidden information. Detectives who had devoted years of their careers to the file understood the privilege and responsibility of witnessing that moment. Many reflected upon the officers who had searched fields during those first desperate days, never knowing that the evidence they collected would someday become the foundation of an extraordinary forensic breakthrough. The investigation had become a testament to patience measured across generations. It demonstrated that justice sometimes advances not through dramatic breakthroughs occurring overnight, but through thousands of careful professional decisions made by individuals who may never personally witness the final outcome. Every evidence technician, every laboratory analyst, every detective, every records custodian contributed something essential. Together they preserved the possibility that truth could survive far longer than memory. Now the investigation stood on the edge of a historic development. The scientific evidence had begun revealing answers unavailable to every previous generation assigned to the case. Detectives understood that what they were preparing to confirm would resonate far beyond the Jessup investigation itself. It would show that biological evidence collected with care can remain one of the most powerful witnesses in criminal justice, even after nearly 40 years of silence. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply waited for science to become capable of uncovering it. Soon, that truth would finally emerge from the shadows, bringing an extraordinary chapter in Canadian criminal history closer to the resolution that investigators, Christine's family, and an entire nation had sought for almost 4 decades. The moment investigators had pursued for nearly 4 decades finally arrived not with celebration, but with verification. In a case that had become one of Canada's most enduring homicide investigations, certainty mattered more than speed. Every laboratory result underwent repeated review. Every scientific conclusion was examined alongside the original investigative record. Detectives understood that after so many years, there could be no room for assumptions. The truth had to rest entirely upon evidence capable of standing on its own. Only when investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors were satisfied that the findings met the highest standards of reliability did the investigation move toward one of the most significant developments in its history. The preserved biological evidence collected in 1984 had done what generations of investigators had hoped it someday might accomplish. Modern DNA analysis identified a genetic profile that investigators were able to associate with Calvin Hoover, a man who had lived in the region at the time of Christine Jessup's murder and who had died in 2015. According to the official investigation announced in 2020, the DNA evidence supported the conclusion that Hoover was responsible for Christine's murder. Because he had died years before the renewed forensic breakthrough, he would never stand trial. The case would never culminate in a courtroom verdict. Instead, justice would take a different form: the official identification of the person responsible through scientific evidence and a comprehensive review of the historical investigation. The announcement marked an extraordinary turning point in Canadian criminal history. For almost 36 years, Christine Jessup's murder had remained one of the nation's most recognized unsolved child homicides. Now, investigators possessed an answer supported by forensic science that simply had not existed when the crime occurred. The evidence had remained silent through changing governments, technological revolutions, and multiple generations of detectives. It had waited until science advanced enough to reveal the identity hidden within microscopic biological traces preserved since 1984. The investigative team emphasized that the conclusion did not arise from a single isolated DNA result. It reflected the careful integration of modern forensic testing with the historical evidence gathered during the original investigation. Detectives reviewed decades of documentation, reconstructed timelines once again, and evaluated every finding against the scientific results. The goal was not merely to identify a DNA profile, but to ensure that every conclusion remained consistent with the known facts of the case. When authorities publicly announced the results in October 2020, Canada watched one of its oldest homicide mysteries finally receive an official resolution. For many Canadians who had followed the case since the 1980s, the news seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Entire generations had grown up believing that Christine Jessup's murder might never be solved. The investigation had become synonymous with the phrase cold case. Yet modern forensic science had demonstrated once again that time does not. can necessarily erase truth. Sometimes it simply delays its discovery. For Christine's family, the announcement carried emotions too complex for simple description. Nothing could restore the childhood stolen in 1984. Nothing could return the daughter, sister, and loved one whose absence had shaped decades of family life. Yet after almost 40 years, they finally possessed something that had remained beyond reach for nearly a lifetime, an official answer regarding who had killed Christine. The grief remained, the loss remained, but uncertainty, the constant companion of unresolved homicide cases, had finally begun to lift. Investigators also reflected upon the remarkable professionalism displayed by those who had worked the case across generations. Officers who searched fields during the autumn of 1984 had preserved evidence with exceptional care despite lacking the scientific tools available decades later. Successive detectives had maintained the integrity of the investigation, refusing to discard evidence or abandon hope. Forensic scientists continuously improved analytical methods capable of recovering increasingly detailed genetic information from historical samples. Each generation contributed essential work without knowing whether they themselves would ever witness the outcome. The case quickly became an international example of the importance of evidence preservation. Police agencies around the world pointed to the investigation as proof that properly stored biological evidence can remain invaluable even after decades. Training programs highlighted the meticulous chain of custody procedures maintained throughout the Jessup investigation. Cold case units referenced the case when encouraging investigators never to assume that current scientific limitations would remain permanent. Tomorrow's laboratory techniques may solve today's unsolved crimes. The announcement also reminded the public of a profound reality about forensic science. DNA does not grow stronger because time passes. Its power comes from scientific progress. The biological material recovered in 1984 contained the same genetic information all along. Investigators simply lacked the technology required to interpret it fully. Advances in laboratory science transformed evidence that had once seemed incomplete into one of the most compelling forms of identification available within modern criminal justice. Although the identification of Calvin Hoover answered the central question surrounding Christine's murder, investigators acknowledged that some details of the crime would likely never be known with complete certainty. Hoover's death in 2015 meant he could never be interviewed under the weight of the new forensic evidence. No confession would explain his actions. No courtroom testimony would reconstruct every moment of the crime. Certain questions died with him. That reality reflects a difficult truth in many cold cases. Scientific breakthroughs can identify offenders long after they lose the opportunity to answer for their crimes personally. Despite that limitation, investigators emphasized that the evidence supporting the conclusion had been thoroughly evaluated according to modern forensic standards. The announcement did not represent speculation or investigative theory. It represented the official findings of a comprehensive review grounded in advanced DNA analysis and supported by decades of investigative work. Communities throughout Ontario reacted with a mixture of relief, reflection, and renewed sorrow. Residents who remembered participating in the original search for Christine revisited memories they had carried since 1984. Former detectives spoke publicly about the emotional significance of finally learning the truth. Many acknowledged colleagues who had dedicated years of their careers to the investigation but had passed away before witnessing its conclusion. The resolution belonged as much to those earlier investigators as it did to the officers making the announcement in 2020. The story also carried broader implications for families living through other unsolved homicide investigations. Christine Jessup's case demonstrated that even after nearly 4 decades, scientific advances could still produce meaningful answers. Across Canada and beyond, families with unresolved cases found renewed hope in the possibility that preserved evidence might someday reveal truths long hidden from investigators. Cold case units received increased public attention as people recognized the extraordinary potential of modern forensic genetics. For detectives, however, the resolution remained deeply personal. Many described the case as a reminder that justice often requires patience extending far beyond individual careers. Officers rarely have the opportunity to solve crimes committed before they entered law enforcement. Yet the Jessup investigation showed that criminal investigations can become shared responsibilities passed from one generation to the next. Every detective who inherited the file preserved its future. Every forensic scientist advanced the possibility of eventual success. Every evidence custodian protected the integrity of the material that ultimately revealed the truth. As the public absorbed the extraordinary announcement, another realization quietly emerged. Solving Christine Jessup's murder did not simply close a historical investigation. It also required Canada to confront difficult chapters within the case's long history, including decisions made during earlier stages of the investigation and their lasting consequences. The forensic breakthrough had identified the person officially determined to be responsible, but it also cast new light upon events that had unfolded years before, events that profoundly affected another life and would soon demand public attention alongside the remarkable scientific achievement that finally brought one of Canada's longest-running murder mysteries to its official conclusion. The official announcement in October 2020 brought long-awaited answers about Christine Jessup's murder, but it also reopened one of the most painful chapters in Canadian criminal justice. Solving a cold case does more than identify the person responsible. It forces investigators, legal institutions, and the public to look back at every stage of the original investigation and ask difficult questions about what happened along the way. In the Christine Jessup case, those questions could not be avoided. The forensic breakthrough that identified Calvin Hoover as the person responsible also reaffirmed a tragedy that had unfolded years earlier, one that had deeply affected another innocent life. During the original investigation, police focused significant attention on Guy Paul Morin, a neighbor of the Jessup family. Morin became a suspect after months of investigation, and over time the case against him relied largely on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and forensic methods that would later prove unreliable. In 1992, Morin was convicted of Christine Jessup's murder. The conviction shocked many Canadians who believed the long-running mystery had finally been solved. For Christine's family, it appeared that justice had finally arrived. For investigators, it seemed the years of work had reached their conclusion. But the story was far from over. From the beginning, Guy Paul Morin maintained his innocence. He consistently denied any involvement in Christine's disappearance or murder. His legal team continued challenging the evidence presented during the trial, particularly as forensic science evolved throughout the 1990s. DNA analysis, still relatively new during the original proceedings, offered an entirely different way of evaluating the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. As laboratories became capable of conducting more sophisticated DNA testing, the results fundamentally changed the case. In 1995, modern DNA analysis excluded Guy Paul Morin as the source of the biological evidence recovered during the investigation. The scientific findings demonstrated that he could not be the person whose DNA had been preserved on the evidence. His conviction was overturned and he was acquitted. The decision sent shockwaves across Canada. One of the country's most significant child murder convictions had collapsed under the weight of new scientific evidence. The justice system faced a deeply uncomfortable reality. An innocent man had spent years accused, convicted, and imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. At the same time, the true killer remained unidentified. The consequences extended far beyond a single courtroom decision. A public inquiry, later known as the Commission on Proceedings Involving Guy Paul Morin, examined how the wrongful conviction had occurred. The inquiry identified numerous problems involving investigative practices, forensic interpretation, disclosure of evidence, and aspects of the prosecution. Its findings would influence criminal justice reforms throughout Canada for years afterward. The inquiry did not diminish the enormous effort investigators had devoted to finding Christine's killer. Rather, it demonstrated how difficult complex homicide investigations can become when scientific limitations, investigative assumptions, and imperfect evidence converge. Many of the forensic techniques available during the 1980s and early 1990s simply lacked the reliability of modern DNA analysis. Methods once considered persuasive were later recognized as carrying significant limitations. For Guy Paul Morin, however,